Hi, everyone. My presentation today is called Do Video Games Have Nice Guy Syndrome? Reshaping the Gamification of Sex. Before talking about nice guy syndrome, there are a couple of premises that I like to make. First of all, the way that the industry has historically represented sex in games has been far from being perfect, as we've seen. It should also be stressed that perfection should not be thought of as the final goal, since it is impossible for representation to classify as such, since no single experience can be representative of different communities. Right. So today's research questions are: how is sexual content represented when it comes to use? What problematic behavior can game mechanics produce? And what practices can improve the representation of sexual content in the future? When it comes to the representation's use of sexual content, as Brenda Romero argues, this classification can be divided into three main categories: sex as mechanic, sex as reward, and sex as aesthetic. For example, in Dragon Age Origins, if the player gives a gift to any member of their party, the relationship bar with this character will increase. When the bar is high enough, a romantic relationship can be pursued. So a lot of times we get the saying gift giving in Dragon Age Origins equals love. The relationship then is a mechanic in the game. And as such, the sex mechanic can be active or passive, depending on the amount of interactivity that is left with the player. The God of War franchise, for instance, is historically famous for having sex minigames present in its games. The player then is actively asked to engage with the sexual activity happening on screen and must press buttons in order for the characters to progressively climax. Contrastingly, if the mechanic is passive, then the player will be presented with the sex scene unfolding in a cinematic fashion through the use of a cutscene. Like in the slide, we have an example coming from Mass Effect 2, which is the sex scene with Miranda and Male Shepard. This practice is in fact very frequent in role-playing games, and even if the player does select the options that will lead to the cutscene, the game is still in control of the sexual content. Similarly, sexual content can be made available as a reward for the player. As Romero argues, quote, "Whenever a game awards or makes sexual content available to the player as a result of his or her actions, sex is being used as a reward," end quote. In other words, whenever the player engages in a specific mechanic successfully, sex can be awarded to them. The rewards in games take different shapes. It could be an achievement the player unlocks, an advantage, or an ability that the player gains after the act, or quite simply, the cutscene where the sexual content unfolds. On the slide, for example, we have the achievement Easy Lover, which the player unlocks after sleeping with Zevran in Dragon Age Origins, or a sex scene with Iron Bull in Dragon Age Inquisition, which might be a reward in itself. Another famous example that is often mentioned in this regard is the use of sex workers in the Grand Theft Auto franchise. In Grand Theft Auto 3, for instance, the player is able to purchase a sex worker's services, and while money decreases, health increases. Consequently, all these rewards reflect play as a practice and gamify and commodify sex. If the player does a series of successful actions, then the player wins the sexual content. Finally, sex can be included in the game as an aesthetic component. Developers can, as Romero explains, quote, "use the sexual content to make the content more appealing to convey a somewhat sexy aesthetic," end quote. While the sexy aesthetic is part of the games where the sexual content is already explicit, this aesthetic also populates games where the sexual content is absent. So sex sells, or that's the hope at least. Sex then can be used as an aesthetic component in advertisement or on video games cover to make them more appealing and inviting. For example, in the slide, there's the cover of Tomb Raider Underworld, which is a good instance of a sexy aesthetic. Tomb Raider Underworld is an action-adventure game, and as far as I'm aware, there is no sexual content in the game. However, the sexy aesthetic is arguably used to make the game more appealing and marketable. The cover sees Lara Croft, the protagonist of the famous franchise, but does not show her face and instead draws the attention to her appealing action body, which is barely covered by tight and revealing clothes. Lara here is covered in dirt, her skin glistens with sweat, highlighting particular features of her body like her chest, her shoulders, her lower abdomen. As Rob Gallagher has argued, this practice may also underline a way of legitimizing video games as, quote, properly heterosexual and manly activity, end quote. While it is important to stress that the representation of sex classifies as taboo, Lauren Rosewarne suggests that the taboo itself can sometimes be what attracts some audiences out of a will to be part of a controversy. So the secret for game developers is finding a balance between being controversial enough to be attractive, but not controversial enough to cause backlash. However, with the practices that I've just described, it would be extremely difficult not to cause backlash. Brent Keiss has investigated sex mechanics in video games, particularly with what he defines as player-connected versus player-disconnected sex acts. If, as explained previously, a sex mechanic can be active or passive, Keiss asks the player to reflect and question, quote, if a sex act in a game is being used as a money shot to sell a game, or if the act is truly being used to simulate sexual experience, end quote. In other words, players need to be aware of problematic practices in order for the industry to progress. Furthermore, Keiss argues for player-connected sex acts in games because these acts would have a higher value and represent sex as a, quote, emotional player-connected human action, end quote. Consequently, Keiss disregards player-disconnected sex acts because, quote, the simulation does not actually reflect the physical experience. Therefore, player-disconnected sex acts cannot be compared to emotionless physical sex, end quote. While the concern is valid and players and developers should be aware of problematic practices for the representation to improve, Keiss's argument is hindered by a restricted point of view. Not everyone sees sex as an emotional human action, and while Keiss acknowledges casual sex but finds it irrelevant for comparison because games do not actually let the players have sex, the same argument could be made with player-connected sex acts. Even if players experience emotional connected sex act in games, players still do not get the simulation of the physical act, but instead understand the emotional connection that Keiss argues for from a narrative point of view through suspension of disbelief. If players have the skills to narratively understand a connected sexual act, then players will also be able to understand a disconnected act through the same set of skills. Furthermore, in both cases, players will experience vicarious participation, which, as Rosewarne explained, lets people quote, experience a sex life they have not experienced simply by watching a character do so, end quote. In other words, there is value in the experience itself, even if it's strictly not physical. The representation of casual sex is not problematic in its own right. It becomes problematic only when this representation is used to reinforce patriarchal values or to objectify. Considering casual sex and its representation as a problem in itself because it's casual only contributes to strengthen the stigma around sex as a whole. What is truly worrisome, as Nicholas Ware argues, appears when sex is reduced to, quote, a rote button pressing minigame and insist of being so phallocentric, end quote. When sex is directly translated to pressing of buttons, as for my God of War Ghost of Sparta example, sex is reduced to a series of penile thrusts. This once again deeply diminishes how sex is understood. Considering sex only as penovaginal penetration problematizes the way one understands sex as a practice because it restricts the topic in consideration. However, the most criticized practice when it comes to representation of sex is the presentation of sex as a reward, as this too can produce problematic behavior. As Nicholas Ware argues, this concern has its roots in the gamification of sex and romance in video games. So if players are rewarded with sex and romance, these two can become conditions that can be won. However, for where, quote, romance and sexuality are nearly the opposite of a menu-based system or flipping of a switch, end quote. By quantifying attraction on a meter by selecting the right options and being rewarded with sex and romance, as seen, for example, in our Dragon Age Origins example, for where video games have nice guy syndrome. Nice guy syndrome indicates a pop psychology term for the misogynistic attitude found in young men where if they accumulate a series of nice deeds, they are then entitled to sex with women as their reward. Because games with branching narratives like RPGs, visual novels, and dating simulators in particular rely on the use of save slots to facilitate replayability, this practice can teach players that if they do a right number of actions, they will undoubtedly receive sex and romance as a reward. In Coming Out on Top, for instance, the player can even scroll back with the mouse wheel to retry a particular choice. Sex and romance then become a formula that can be simply put together and that works perfectly in every possible scenario. Sex and romance are seen as formulas that players can discover. How can the industry improve on the representation of these practices? For where there is a possibility for change by increasing the influence of random number generation or RNG design philosophy. If players are easily able to discern the effectiveness of a dialogue option in the romance or sex route of a game, they will, as Ware argues, quote, treat in-game relationship like a prize to be won instead of an experience to convey, end quote. However, if relationships are not comparable to a winning state or a flipping of a switch, I would argue that they're not entirely random either. While RNG design philosophy would reflect the, quote, often inscrutable variation of relationships, end quote, player needs to be able to understand how to engage with a mechanic in order for them to pursue it. In fact, if the mechanics were too inscrutable, then players may decide not to engage with them altogether. And if, as researchers and designers, we want players to use the representation of sex and romance as tools to experiment with their own identities and sexualities, since we recognize the potential of the practice, we need players to be able to understand, to an extent, how to engage with that mechanic. The complexity of the matter then lies in finding a satisfactory balance to mediate these practices. In other words, how can one transform sex and romance into practices players will want to pursue without using design practices that implicitly promote problematic behavior? While there has not been a game, to my knowledge, that ideally compromises with the representation of sex and romance without encountering at least one of the problems that this presentation lists, there are sides of different game mechanics and storylines that can be a step in the right direction, particularly considering that the context of sexual representation is evolving. Monster Prom, for example, contains instances of these mediations in its game mechanics. The game presents itself as the first competitive dating simulator where players can play together, online or otherwise, and try to build successful relationship with characters, which will allow them to ask their prospective love interest to prom. In Monster Prom, the game experience is unaffected by gender or sexual orientation, since, as the developers say, finding love is already hard enough. At first glance, however, the competitiveness of the game itself lets one understand that romance is already conceptualized something to win if players succeed at inviting the characters to prom or lose if they're rejected. However, Monster Prom has interesting practices in the modality that the player reaches those states. While the game promises more than 1,000 scenarios and events for the players to unlock, the game does not include save slots. The game then is incredibly replayable, but players will need to have different playthroughs each time, choosing between a short and a long playthrough option. For this reason, players will not be presented with the same scenarios each time, particularly in the first few playthroughs, and cannot consequently polish their answers. As we can see in the screenshot of the game, the right option is entirely dependent on the player character stats. In other words, even if the player encounters the same scenario, the answer that had worked in a previous playthrough may not work in the new one if the player character stats are different. And also the two answers here are not easily intelligible in the sense that we don't know which stat exactly is part of the answer because the game doesn't tell us explicitly. So consequently, the game tells the player that if they want to succeed, they have to learn about their own avatar. And so the stats represent what the player character is good at and about the character that they're trying to woo. This practice then can arguably represent the inscrutable variation of relationships that I was talking about before that were discussed, while at the same time still having a discernible game mechanic that players can engage with. Another example would be Lady Killer in a Bind. Instead, it shows that it is possible to have a game mechanic that actively uses sex without making it phallocentric. Lady Killer in a Bind's protagonist is an 18-year-old lesbian. The dialogue options appear gradually on screen so that the player has the ability to wait for to wait and see if a better option appears, while at the same time risking that the player character doesn't say anything and does not react to the other characters, and then the characters react to her silence. So in the screenshot here, we can see this. So we see all the different options that come little by little, but the player doesn't know whether there's going to be other option coming or not. So they might be silent in that instance. However, the game offers save slots and consequently a possibility for players to polish their answers. Nonetheless, much of the character development in the game happens during sex. The character of the beauty and the hacker are mainly encountered at night, and their character development is done through sex. Every night, the player discovers something more about the character themselves, and they would not have learned that information without actively engaging with sex. Furthermore, the game shows that sex is not only constituted by the activity in itself, but that other factors too, like chatting, kissing, and teasing, are included. In this way, the game offers an exploration of sexuality, as well as an active sexual representation that does not reduce and restrict sex. To conclude, these examples show that while an entirely satisfactory representation of sex is not yet available, there are different practices that could be implemented in game design to improve the representation of sex and sexuality. The problems most of the game have encountered in this section lie behind the possibility to save the game and polish one's answers. There needs to be a balance between replayability and sex and romance without having them feature as rewards. As Gallagher argues, sex should be represented as a, quote, set of rewarding mechanics rather than a reward for mastering those mechanics, end quote. These rewarding mechanics could lie, as discussed, in the way that the player has to discern the romance or sex mechanic without, however, facilitating it too much. As Ware argues, new design methodologies and philosophies, quote, may bring new sets of issues, but alternatives to iterative design should be pursued by the industry as possible solutions, end quote. Creating satisfactory examples is complex, but games should still be willing to represent them to help the industry improve and move forward in a world whose context is too moving forward. Thank you very much.